Billie-Jo was born in East London on the 23rd of March 1983. Initially, her life was tough to begin with. By the time she was 8 years old, her father had been sent to prison, while her mother, who was now looking after Billie-Jo alone, struggled to cope. As a result, Billie-Jo was placed into foster care. In 1993, when she was 9 years old, she was fostered by Sean and Lois Jenkins. The pair were married and had 4 children of their own. Sean was a deputy headmaster at William Park Boys Comprehensive School in Hastings at the time. Over the next 4 years, Billie-Jo would settle into her new life well. She was very much treated as one of their own and well loved by her family, who were well respected in the local area. She was also doing well in school at the time and had many friends. Life seemed to be perfect for the young girl. However, on the 15th of February 1997, Billie-Jo's life would take a dramatic and tragic turn. On the morning of the 15th of February 1997, Billie-Jo needed money to buy new shoes that she had her eye on. She asked Sean for the money, who agreed to pay for the shoes, provided that she, along with her sisters, carry out some chores around the home. Her foster mother was out at the time, having taken 2 of the children out with her to go for a walk along the beach. One of the other children had also been away from the home, attending a clarinet lesson with a friend. Sean had tasked his remaining daughter with cleaning the storeroom, while Billie-Jo was to sweep the patio and paint its door. When it was time for Sean to pick up his daughter and her friend from their clarinet lesson, Sean decided to take his daughter, who was helping with him, with Billie-Jo opting to stay in order to complete her jobs. Sean picked up his daughter and her friend and took the friend home at around 3:15 p.m. When he returned home, Sean realised that he needed to purchase white spirit. He then took his 2 daughters to a nearby hardware shop, but when he arrived, he realised that he didn't have any cash with him to buy the white spirit. Sean then went back to his home, where he went inside for about 3 minutes to collect his cash while his biological daughters waited in the car. Having returned from the hardware shop with the white spirit, one of Sean's daughters entered the home first. Moments later, she screamed out for her father, who rushed in to find Billie-Jo lying in a pool of blood on the patio. Sean removed his shocked daughters from the scene and knelt down beside his foster daughter. After examining her injuries, he called 999.
My daughter's fallen, or she's got head injuries. There's blood everywhere.
Well, she's banged her head and bleeding from the head.
Yes, well, I don't know. There's blood everywhere on her head. She's lying on the floor.
And can I take your name, sir?
Sean Jenkins.
Okay. And you say she's unconscious. Is she breathing all right?
I don't know. I haven't looked.
Right. Okay. Did this happen while you were at the house then?
Yes, it is. I've just this minute got back.
All right. So you don't know how long ago it would have.
I don't know how. Well, in the last, I don't know, half an hour, 3/4 of an hour.
After calling 999, Sean then called a neighbour who came to look after the 2 daughters who witnessed their foster sister laying lifeless on the patio. Sean would call 999 again on the advice of the neighbour. Police and ambulance services would arrive, where they would find Sean sitting in his Rover MG convertible. Sadly, Billie-Jo Jenkins was already dead by the time they arrived. Billie-Jo had been beaten over the head with a 45cm metal tent spike, which was in the back garden of the Jenkins home. She had sustained between 9 and 10 blows, crushing her skull. She had also sustained a broken nose, as well as internal bleeding in her lungs and 2 broken ribs. Strangely, a small piece of plastic bag had been found stuffed up her nose. This was earlier spotted by the neighbour who Sean called after first calling 999. Furthermore, defensive wounds were also found on Billie-Jo's body, as well as other bruising which was believed to be around 1 to 2 weeks old. Finally, there were no signs that Billie-Jo had been sexually assaulted. What happened to Billie-Jo could only be described as a frenzied attack, with a very small window of opportunity to take place. Police would quickly begin their investigation. The murder of Billie-Jo quickly grabbed headlines across the country, and police were soon under pressure to resolve this terrible crime. They would quickly identify a potential suspect, known only as Mr. B. Mr. B was understood to be a man who was mentally ill. He was allegedly spotted near the Jenkins residence at the time police believe the murder took place. Mr. B also had a fetish for plastic bags. He even had a piece of plastic bag up his own nose at the time police arrested him for questioning. However, police would quickly rule out Mr. B after witnesses stated they had seen him in a park near the Jenkins home at the time of the murder. The Jenkins family told police that they were worried about prowlers and break-ins which had been taking place in the area in the weeks building up to Billie-Jo's murder. They had installed security lights as well as fitting window locks to their home. They had even talked of one time where a man was staring into the windows of their parents' home during Christmas, and again, Sean had seen a man staring into their own window while he was at Alexandra Park, which was opposite their home, although by the time Sean had got to his home, the man had vanished. It was also discovered that Billie-Jo had been complaining to friends and family that she was being followed by a man. The family would receive silent calls to their home, and on the 12th of January 1997, a voice message was left by what sounded like an American woman, who said chillingly, "He will come again and be our judge." Understandably, this frightened the family. On the 13th of February 1997, just 2 days before the murder, Billie-Jo would stay at a friend's house after being spotted outside her home with the family dog Buster. When asked why she hadn't gone inside, she told her friend that she was too scared to go indoors because of the prowler who had been stalking around Lower Park Road over the previous months. On the 24th of February 1997, 9 days after Billie-Jo's murder, police had identified their next potential suspect. Only this time, the man they would accuse would be someone that would shock not only the local community, but the entire nation. Sean Jenkins was under arrest. Police were already suspicious of Sean early on in their investigation. As they looked into the movements of the family on the day of the murder, they learned of Sean's trip to the hardware shop to buy white spirit. However, when police searched the family home for evidence, they found a half-full bottle of white spirit in the back of one of the cupboards. Furthermore, they discovered that instead of heading straight to the hardware shop, Sean instead drove the other way, circling a nearby park twice before heading to the shop. Additionally, they learned of Sean forgetting his money and returning to the home, leaving his biological daughters alone in the car. This gave the police a window of time where it was just Billie-Jo and Sean alone in the home. They also questioned why Sean had not performed CPR or placed Billie-Jo in the recovery position upon discovering her. Even more strangely, after calling 999, he left Billie-Jo's body, went outside his home, sat in his car, and closed the roof of his MG convertible. 158 microscopic blood spots were also discovered on Sean's clothing. Police believe these spots, which were naked to the human eye, may have sprayed on Sean while he was allegedly attacking Billie-Jo. Police had also learned that Sean had exaggerated his qualifications on his CV, calling into question his character. However, the most damning suspicion would come from his own wife, Lois. She would say that at the time she learned Billie-Jo had been killed, she embraced Sean for comfort. However, she felt as though he was cold and distant. She also felt no emotion in his voice when he explained to their 4 daughters that their sister had died. She came to the realization that Sean could have possibly been responsible for Billie-Jo's death, as she lay next to him one night soon after the murder took place. She would claim that Sean was a violent, controlling man who would regularly beat her and hit his daughters, Billie-Jo included. She would say that Sean would use a stick to hit the children with should they misbehave. Sean Jenkins would be released on bail on the 25th of February 1997, where he would leave Hastings to live with his parents in Wales. He would be charged with Billie-Jo's murder on the 14th of March 1997 and bailed again 10 days later. Sean Jenkins' trial would begin in April 1998. However, it would be adjourned before resuming on the 3rd of June that same year. The prosecution would tell the jury that Billie-Jo's murder took place during the 3-minute window where Sean had entered the home to collect his money. They claimed that he flew into a rage, picked up the tent pick, and violently attacked his foster daughter. They would call on a forensic expert who testified that the only way the microscopic blood spots could have got onto Sean's clothes would be while she was being attacked. On the 2nd of July 1998, the jury would find Sean Jenkins guilty of the murder of Billie-Jo Jenkins. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Soon after Sean's conviction, Lois left Hastings with her 4 daughters and moved to Tasmania, Australia. Immediately after his conviction, Sean Jenkins filed for appeal. This was rejected in April 1999. However, in May 2003, his case was referred back to the Court of Appeal after a 2-year investigation by the Criminal Cases Review Commission. His second appeal took place in August 2004 and was successful. Jenkins's original conviction was overturned and a new trial was ordered. Sean was released on bail pending this new trial. In April 2005, Sean Jenkins' retrial began. The defence this time would focus on the blood, arguing that they were able to demonstrate another explanation for the blood on Sean's clothes. The defence argued that the blood found on Sean's clothes wasn't there because he attacked her. Instead, it was more likely that it was expiration spatter, which was released by the build-up of pressure in Billie-Jo's lungs. They argued that the blood was expelled while Sean was beside Billie-Jo at the time. They were also able to call upon experts who testified that the blood found on Sean's clothes could be successfully recreated through experimentation. Despite this new evidence, the jury were unable to reach a verdict, and on the 11th of July 2005, a hung jury was called. The prosecution immediately requested a third trial, which was accepted. However, after the jury were again unable to reach a majority verdict, the prosecution confirmed that they would not be seeking another retrial. Sean Jenkins was formally acquitted and free to go. To this day, Sean Jenkins denies any involvement with Billie-Jo Jenkins' murder. He has made numerous television appearances, most notably on the show Tonight with Trevor McDonald, which I've linked in the description below. He has also written a book, The Murder of Billie-Jo, which was co-written by investigative journalist Bob Woffenden, again where he shares his side of the story. He also unsuccessfully attempted to claim compensation for his time spent in prison. He has since remarried. Lois Jenkins still lives in Tasmania. She still believes that Sean was the man who killed Billie-Jo and has gone on record since to explain her life with him, as well as why she thinks her ex-husband was the real killer. Sean has not seen his daughters since being released from prison. The murder of Billie-Jo Jenkins is a case which has sadly gone cold. On the 14th of February 2017, 20 years since Billie-Jo was killed, her biological mother called for police to reopen the case, 5 years after Sean Jenkins himself called for the same, after it emerged that Anthony Emilia, otherwise known as the M25, lived just 20 miles from the Jenkins home. He was known to target young girls, with his youngest victim being just 10 years old. An investigation by the Mirror found that Emilia's description matched that of the person who was stalking Billie-Jo in the months leading up to her attack. He was also known on one occasion to place a plastic bag over a victim's head. Despite this information, it doesn't appear that there's been any movement on these leads. The police seem to be confident that he isn't linked, and there have been no new developments since their last review of the case in 2006, several months after Sean was released. Police also failed to test the tent pick used to beat Billie-Jo for DNA. While the science behind DNA analysis wasn't as advanced then as it is now, surely they should have still examined it, as it could have provided the police with crucial evidence for their investigation. But I'd like to know what you think. Was Sean responsible? Mr. B? Anthony Emilia? Or was it someone else? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Either way, I truly hope that the truth is revealed so that Billie-Jo's friends and family can move on from this tragedy. However, this could soon change, as police announced on the 31st of January this year that they would be carrying out a forensic review of the evidence that was recovered at the time of the murder. One of those crucial pieces of evidence are the 148 blood spots that were found on Sean's clothes. These blood spots were naked to the human eye and were a major point of contention during his many trials. Police are hoping to uncover new leads using advancements in forensic science. At this moment in time, her murder is not being reinvestigated, but Sussex police stated that unsolved homicide cases are reviewed every 2 years to see if any new evidence could make reopening a case a viable option. We won't know more until the review has been completed, but I'll be keeping a close eye on the case and updating you when I know more. Fingers crossed police can uncover new evidence that will shed light on a case that has had them baffled for more than 25 years. Sadly, Billie-Jo's birth mother, Deborah Barnett, died in 2018, and so should the case be reopened, she won't be around to potentially find out what happened to her daughter. For me personally, my hope is that enough new evidence can be found that would justify reopening the case, so we can finally learn the truth as to what happened to Billie-Jo all those years ago. Giorgio Soddu was born in Tula, Sardinia, Italy in 1895. In 1908, and at 13 years of age, Giorgio immigrated to America with his older brother. However, when he arrived at Ellis Island, Giorgio's brother immediately turned around and went back to Italy, leaving the younger teenager alone in the land of opportunity. He would soon change his name to George Sodder and begin to find work. George would soon find employment in Pennsylvania, where he would work on the railroads, carrying water and supplies to those working there. He would later take up a job as a haulage driver in Smithers, West Virginia. It would be in this job that George would learn the tricks of the trade. George saved money and studied the workings of the haulage industry, eventually finding himself in a position where he was able to set up his own trucking company. His company at first hauled dirt to construction sites, but later evolved to hauling coal that was mined within the local region. It was here in Smithers that George met Jenny Cipriani through her father, who was a storekeeper in Smithers. Jenny herself was an Italian migrant who moved to the United States at a young age with her parents. After meeting George, the pair would fall in love and eventually marry. The couple moved to a 2-story timber frame home in Fayetteville and had their first child in 1923. The pair would go on to have 10 children. At the time, the local population had a large Italian demographic. George's business would continue to grow, and the Sodders would quickly become one of the most well-respected middle-class families in Fayetteville. While the family was respected, this wasn't without controversy. It was said that George was very secretive about his past and did not speak about his life prior to moving to America. Furthermore, he was also said to be a very outspoken individual. He was not shy in expressing his opinions, even if it meant alienating others. In particular, George was a fierce critic of then Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini. This led to tensions within the Italian community, as many were offended with George's views of the fascist dictator. These tensions would escalate after Mussolini was executed in April 1945. 6 months later, in October, the family were visited by an insurance salesman looking to strike up business. George would swiftly decline his proposal, leading to the salesman losing his temper and exploding at George, telling him that his house would go up in smoke and that his children would be destroyed. The salesman told George that this was because of, quote, the dirty remarks you have been making about Mussolini, end quote. Soon after this encounter, another man visited the home, seemingly searching for work. While there, he mentioned to George that the fuse boxes at the back of the home could cause a fire one day. This puzzled George, as he only recently had the house rewired after installing a new electric stove. The wiring was also signed off as safe by the local electricity company who carried out the work. George declined the man's suggestions and sent him on his way, believing the man was making up the excuse of faulty wiring to score some work. As Christmas drew nearer, The Sodders' eldest sons noticed a car that they didn't recognise parked on the main highway, which went through the town. They said that the people inside the car were watching their younger siblings while they were on their way home from school. However, this would pale in comparison to the horror that the family would experience on Christmas Eve, 1945. George and Jenny's eldest daughter, Marion, had returned home after working at a dime store, where she surprised 3 of her younger sisters, Martha, 12, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, with presents that she had bought for them. Naturally, the unexpected gift of toys sent the young girls into excitement. They pleaded with their mother to stay up later than normal so that they could play with them. Jenny agreed to this at 10 p.m, on the condition that both Maurice, 14, and Louis, 9, would stay up to put the cows in and feed the chickens before they went to bed. She then took the youngest child, Sylvia, who was only 2 years old, and herself to bed for the night. George and her 2 oldest boys, John, 23, who had returned home for Christmas after serving in World War II, and George Jr., who was 16, were already in bed at the time after spending the day working together. At around midnight, Jenny was awoken to the phone ringing in George's office. Jenny stumbled out of bed, went to the office, and answered the call. On the other line, Jenny heard a woman and what seemed to be other people chatting in the background. The woman asked to speak to someone whose name Jenny did not recognise. When Jenny informed the woman that she had the wrong number, the woman on the phone laughed strangely before abruptly hanging up. While this was an odd experience, Jenny didn't think much of it, but before she went to bed, she noticed that while she was the only person awake in the house, all the lights were on, the curtains were left open, and the front door was unlocked. Jenny shut the curtains, locked the door, and switched the lights off, thinking that her children had simply forgotten and headed back to bed. At around 1:30 a.m, just as Jenny was slipping back into a deep sleep, she heard an object landing on the roof of the home before rolling down the side of the building. It was only moments later that Jenny smelled smoke. The house was on fire. Jenny frantically shook George awake and alerted him of the fire. The pair ran out of their bedroom to find the hallway completely filled with smoke and flames covering the stairway which led to the children's bedrooms. George and Jenny shouted for their children and called for them to flee the house urgently. Once they were outside, they were horrified to learn that only 4 of the 9 children had managed to escape the blaze. George had initially tried to break a window to regain entry into the home, but injured himself when he sliced his arm on the broken glass. He was also beaten back by the intensity of the fire and was unable to see through the thick smoke consuming the family home. George was now in a panic. Knowing his children were still inside, he planned to get them out through the top floor window, using a ladder which he always kept standing on the side of his home. However, when he got there, he was shocked to discover that the ladder was not in its usual resting spot. Confused, George quickly thought to pull one of his 2 trucks to the side of the house, where he could climb and assist with helping his children out the window. Only when he tried starting both trucks, none of them would start. This was the worst timing possible, as both George's trucks were in good working order as recently as the previous day. The family were horrified to learn that there was nothing they could do but watch their home burn. While this was going on, George and Jenny's daughter Marion raced to a neighbour's house to call for the Fayetteville Fire Department. She managed to alert the neighbours, but when they tried to call through, they got no answer. Unbeknownst to Marion, another neighbour had also seen the inferno and made his way to a local tavern in order to contact the fire department, but again, there was no answer. This neighbour then rushed into town and tracked down Fire Chief F.J. Morris. Morris initiated Fayetteville's phone tree system to alert firefighters of the situation. Allegedly, Morris was unable to drive the fire truck, and as many were volunteer firefighters who were away celebrating Christmas at the time, responding to the emergency was terribly slow. Despite just being 2.5 miles away, the crew arrived at the Sodders location at 8 a.m. Christmas morning. The fire, which only lasted 45 minutes, had long burned the house down to smoking ash. The Sodder family, understandably, were resigned to the fact that 5 of their children had perished in the fire. However, a search of the ruins revealed no trace of Maurice, Martha, Lewis, Jenny, or Betty. Fire Chief Morris suggested that the intense heat could have resulted in temperatures hot enough to completely incinerate the bodies, a claim which George and Jenny didn't initially dispute. Following a brief investigation at the property, police determined that the fire was caused by faulty wiring and that the children had indeed died in the home. George would soon cover what would have been the basement in dirt, with the intention of creating a memorial to remember his children by. It wouldn't take long before George and Jenny would begin questioning the official report into the deaths of their children. They wanted to know how faulty wiring was to blame for the fire, when Jenny stated that the lights were working shortly before the blaze, as well as seeing lights still working in the house during the fire. Surely if there was faulty wiring, there would be no lights. This played on their minds. As well as this, was the sheer lack of human remains found on the property. While they recognised that there may not be complete remains, surely there would be something. Furthermore, there were no reports suggesting the family or anyone who arrived on the scene on the morning after smelled burning flesh. George would eventually find the missing ladder, which was hidden in an embankment near the home. Jenny would go as far as to conduct her own experiments, burning the remains of animal bones, chicken bones, beef joints and pork chop bones, just to see what would remain after they were set on fire. Each time she was left with charred bones. Jenny would visit a crematorium where a staff member would tell her that even after a body is burned at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, just over 1000 degrees Celsius, for 2 hours, there would still be bone fragments which would remain. To put this into contrast, the Sodder home burned to the ground in just 45 minutes. This indicated that the fire was a violent one, intensified by the timber framing, but it wouldn't have been burning anywhere near long enough to completely destroy the remains. George and Jenny began to look into this deeper. A telephone repairman would inspect the wiring and tell George that it appeared to have been cut and not burned as officially stated. Additionally, while the family were visiting the memorial, their daughter Sylvia found a green rubber object in the yard. Jenny remembered the thud on the roof which woke her, as well as the rolling sound. George would inspect this object and determine it to be a pineapple bomb. The family now believed that this wasn't an accident, but that it was an intentional attack on the family. And it wouldn't be long before witnesses began coming forward. A bus driver would come forward and describe seeing what he believed to be fireballs being thrown onto the roof of the Sodder home on the night of the fire. Another woman claimed to have clearly witnessed the 5 children in a car which she didn't recognise going away from the home as the fire was ongoing. There was also another woman who said that she had served breakfast to the 5 children and an unspecified number of adults at a diner approximately 50 miles west of Fayetteville on Christmas morning, just hours after the fire. There was even a report of 4 of the 5 children being spotted with 4 adults at a hotel in Charleston, South Carolina. Allegedly, the woman who had seen them recognised the children from photographs which were printed in newspapers. When she approached them, the adults became aggressive towards her and ushered the children away, not allowing the woman to speak with the children. The woman described the 4 adults as being 2 men and 2 women, all who appeared to have an Italian background. Armed with this information, George and Jenny Sodder returned to the police and demanded a more thorough investigation as to what happened on the night of the fire. However, the police refused. They were satisfied with the original coroner's inquiry and were convinced no crime had been committed. In 1947, George and Jenny even wrote to the FBI asking for them to investigate. They would receive the following reply from J. Edgar Hoover. "Although I would like to be of service, the matter related appears to be of local character and does not come within the investigative jurisdiction of this bureau. Hoover's agents would say that if they received permission from the local authorities, they would assist. However, their offer would be declined by the Fayetteville Police and Fire Department. Desperate, the pair turned to private investigator C.C. Tinsley for his assistance. While investigating, he learned that the insurance salesman who had threatened George and his family shortly before the fire was actually a member of the coroner's jury who deemed the fire to be accidental. Furthermore, he had caught wind of a rumour regarding Fire Chief F.J. Morris. According to a Fayetteville minister, while Morris claimed that there were no remains found, Morris had told the minister in confidence that he in fact discovered a human heart among the ruins. He allegedly placed the heart in a dynamite box and buried it at the site. Tinsley spoke to Morris and convinced him to show him the location of the heart. Morris eventually agreed, and together they dug up the box and took it to a funeral director who examined the remains. However, it was discovered that the human heart was in fact beef liver, which showed no signs of fire damage. The Sodder family would learn of rumours that Morris had actually not found any remains, but instead purchased the beef liver and buried it, in the hope that should the family find any remains, this would be enough to satisfy the family that their children were dead and put an end to their investigation. As time went on, George came across a photo of school children from New York City in a newspaper. He believed that one of the children bore a striking resemblance to his daughter, Betty. Convinced that she was his daughter, he travelled by car to Manhattan and eventually tracked her down, although the child's parents refused to let George see the child. By August 1949, George decided to conduct a fresh search at the site of their old home. He brought in Oscar B. Hunter, a pathologist from Washington, D.C. George carried out a thorough excavation of the site and uncovered many small items, including damaged coins, a partly burned dictionary, but most importantly, bones. Hunter took the bones and sent these to the Smithsonian Institution. After examining the bones, they issued the following report. The human bones consist of 4 lumbar vertebrae belonging to one individual. Since the transverse recesses are fused, the age of this individual at death should have been 16 or 17 years. The top limit of age should be about 22 since the centra, which normally fuse at 23, are still unfused. On this basis, the bones show greater skeletal maturation than one would expect for a 14-year-old boy, the oldest missing Sodder child. It is, however, possible, although not probable, for a boy 14 and a half years old to show 16 to 17 maturation. There was no evidence to suggest that the bones had been exposed to fire. The report also noted that it was very strange that no other bones were found in the allegedly careful evacuation of the basement of the house. They would have expected there to have been full skeletons, given that the house only burned for 45 minutes. It was determined in the report that the bones likely came from the supply of dirt George used to fill in the basement while creating the memorial for his children. The report would trigger 2 hearings at the Capitol in Charleston. However, it was ruled by Governor Oki L. Patterson and State Police Superintendent W.E. Burchett that the Sodders' search for their children was hopeless. The case was declared closed. However, George and Jenny were not deterred and erected a billboard near their former home along Route 16, showing pictures of their 5 children. The Sodders also offered a reward of $5,000 for the safe return of their children, although this would eventually rise to $10,000. A letter arrived soon after from a woman in St. Louis who claimed that the Sodders' oldest daughter, Martha, was in a convent there. On another occasion in Texas, someone came forward claiming to have overheard a conversation in a bar where a man was discussing a fire in West Virginia in an incriminating manner. Finally, another rumour sprung up in Florida, where someone alleged that the children were in fact staying with a distant relative of Jenny's. George would investigate every lead and travel to the locations, but sadly each time he came back with nothing. The leads then stopped for almost 20 years, until one morning, Jenny would find an envelope addressed specifically to her. The envelope was postmarked in Kentucky, but contained no return address. When Jenny opened the envelope, she found inside a photo of a man who looked like he was in his mid-20s. On the back of the photograph, there was a handwritten note which read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Lil Boys, A90132 or or 35. This was perhaps the biggest lead the family had since that fateful night of the fire. Here in their possession was a picture of a man who bore a striking resemblance to Louis Sodder. The man had dark curly hair, dark brown eyes, and had the same shaped nose, as well as the same upward tilt of the left eyebrow. The pair were absolutely convinced that Louis was trying to reach out to his mother through a cryptic message and photo. The pair decided to hire another private investigator to try and track down the man they were sure was Louis. The private eye was tasked with going to Kentucky and did so, but unfortunately for the Sodders, they would never again see the investigator. Worried that by publishing the letter or naming the place where the letter came from would harm their son, they decided to instead update the billboard with the image of the man they believed to be Louis, as well as hanging an enlarged copy of the image over their fireplace. It should be noted that authorities were still not convinced of foul play and believed that the letter George and Jenny received was nothing more than a sick hoax. Tragically, George would die a year later in 1969. Jenny would continue searching for answers until her eventual death in 1989. Sadly, neither would find the answers they both so desperately yearned for. Today, the youngest Sodder child and last surviving sibling, Sylvia Sodder, as well as her children and grandchildren, have vowed to keep searching for answers as to what happened that fateful night on Christmas 1945. Sylvia is also convinced that her siblings were not killed in the fire that night. Her family believe that maybe the mafia tried to recruit George, who declined, or that George was targeted for his views about Mussolini. Another theory they have is that they may have tried to extort money from George, who refused, or that perhaps the children were kidnapped by someone they knew, who may have alerted the children to the fire and offered to take them someplace safe. I think it goes without saying that this is an extremely intriguing case, which after researching definitely left me with more questions than answers. I can only imagine the pain that George and Jenny felt while searching for definitive answers as to what happened to their children. I personally found it heartbreaking knowing that they never got the closure they desperately sought. George has said in an interview shortly before his death that time was running out for him and Jenny, and that ultimately, if the children did perish in the fire, they just needed to be convinced. However, if that was the case, there was so much strange behaviour leading up to and after the fire that I don't think that they could ever be truly convinced that that was the case, and I wouldn't blame them. How did the ladder get moved? Why didn't two perfectly working trucks work when needed most? Why did F.J. Morris want the family to stop investigating? Where did the other investigator go after leaving for Kentucky? One can only speculate. Amy Lynn Bradley was born on the 12th of May 1974 and lived in Petersburg, Virginia. Her parents were Ron and Ivor Bradley, and she was the eldest of two children. Her younger brother was named Brad. At the time, Amy had just graduated from college and was getting ready to start a new job. She had also recently moved to a new apartment. Her life was slowly falling into place, but she would receive an invitation from her parents to join them and her brother for a once-in-a-lifetime holiday opportunity. Ron, along with several other members of staff, earned a Caribbean cruise holiday through his work, and while this prize only covered the cost for himself and his wife, they decided to pay for their children to join them. Amy was apprehensive at first. Despite being a confident swimmer, as well as being a trained lifeguard, she was known to be fearful of oceans. Despite her concerns, her family managed to convince Amy to join them on the cruise, and a flight was arranged for Amy and Brad to meet their parents in San Juan on the 21st of March 1998. Along with the usual holiday items, Amy packed 15 rolls of film, as she was planning to make a collage for her coffee table. She also sent 2 postcards, one which read, "Hey, it's beautiful here. Old San Juan has got some amazing buildings. I am taking pictures. Maybe you can see them at Easter. Wish you were here. Amy." while the other postcard said, "Hey girl, it's gorgeous here. We leave for Aruba tomorrow. Take care. Tell Madison and Niles hello. I'll be home Saturday at 10. See ya, Amy." Amy had recently adopted a female bulldog that Madison and Niles were caring for, which Amy named Daisy, and she was planning to collect the dog once she returned home from her cruise. By now, the worries Amy had before seemed to evaporate, with excitement replacing her previous feelings. The idea of being surrounded by ocean waters was still an afterthought, but this had been pushed into the back of her mind and replaced with an eagerness to enjoy the experience. However, unbeknownst to everyone, the dream of a happy family holiday would quickly turn into any parent's worst nightmare. The Rhapsody of the Seas is a cruise line vessel, which at the time had not been on open waters for very long. In fact, its maiden voyage only took place on the 19th of May 1997, just under a year prior to Amy and her family boarding the vessel. The 279-metre or 915-foot long ship can hold up to just under 2,500 passengers and possesses 12 decks. Despite being built in France and owned by Royal Caribbean International, who are based in Miami, Florida, the vessel was registered in Oslo, Norway. This was a popular practice of cruise operators at the time, as this avoided complicated regulatory practices, as well as lower or zero tax costs to the company. Although one of the drawbacks of this is that it can complicate criminal investigations. During this time, maritime laws would state that should a crime occur on a vessel while out on international waters, it would fall under the laws and jurisdiction of the nation where the vessel was registered. This meant that many people who travel on cruise liners aren't aware that the laws and rights they're used to experiencing may not apply to them while on board. While I could go into much further detail about this, I think it's important to have an awareness of this now, in preparation for what I'll be explaining later in the video. On the 23rd of March, the cruise liner had departed Aruba and was on its way to Curacao. Before boarding, this picture was taken of the family. On board, the family prepared for an evening of eating, drinking, and dancing. There was a band playing that night called the Blue Orchid, who boarded the vessel earlier to perform for the guests. Amy had caught the attention of several crew, and at one point, while she and Brad were at the casino, a crew member approached the table and asked for Amy by name. He asked her parents whether Amy would be interested in joining him and some of the other crew for drinks off of the ship. When Amy returned, they informed her of this proposal, to which Amy promptly rejected, saying she would absolutely not go with them because the crew gave her the creeps. As the evening progressed, Ron and Ivor retired for the night at around 1 AM, while Amy and Brad continued partying. By now, they had befriended the Blue Orchid band, with Amy seen dancing with the band's frontman, Alistair "Yellow" Douglas. Brad returned to the family suite at approximately 3:35 AM, while Amy returned shortly after, about 5 minutes later. This was confirmed due to the ship's electronic logging system, which recorded the times guests entered their rooms, but not the times they left. The pair then set out on the balcony and talked, where Amy mentioned needing to buy cigarettes. Brad would get tired and go to bed, leaving Amy on the balcony. At about 5:30 AM, Ron woke up and saw Amy asleep on the deck chair out on the balcony. Noticing the balcony door was still closed, he fell back to sleep. However, at about 6 AM, Ron woke up again, and this time noticed that the balcony door was open. Amy wasn't there. Her cigarettes and lighter were missing, but her shoes were still on the balcony. Not thinking much of this, Ron assumed that Amy had gone to get a drink and smoke a cigarette. But after Amy failed to return, he immediately suspected something was wrong and left to go to find his daughter. After searching on deck for about an hour, Ron's concerns only grew, and he had no choice but to go back and wake up Ivor and Brad. The Bradley family continued searching for Amy, looking at retracing their steps from the previous night in the hopes she would be found. However, they had no joy. Still unable to find her and growing ever more worried, they reported her missing to the crew staff. At this time, the ship had already docked at Curacao and was preparing to let passengers off onto the mainland. Ron and Ivor spoke with the ship's security chief, Lou Costello, and begged him not to let anyone off the ship, as well as make a PA announcement and to carry out a full search of the ship. Lou, however, refused this request, believing Amy was likely with another guest on the ship, or that she had already got off the boat to explore Curacao. Ivor continued to beg and plead with the security chief until he eventually relented and agreed to conduct a full search of the ship and place a call on the PA system for Amy to make herself known to the crew staff. By then, however, almost 2,000 passengers were off the boat and freely exploring the island. After Amy failed to respond to the PA announcements, Ivor and Ron got in touch with the ship's captain, Kjetil Gerstad, at around noon to distribute pictures of Amy across the vessel and to give to other passengers. The captain refused, stating that he didn't see it as appropriate, as he didn't want to cause alarm and distress to the other passengers. The crew weren't that much help either. It was thought many of them believed that Amy had simply left the ship to buy cigarettes, after overhearing Brad stating this to the ship's captain. Predictably, Amy failed to return to the ship, and Gerstad ordered the staff to search all rooms of the cruise ship, and just under 1,000 rooms, restaurants, and facilities. Again, Amy was nowhere to be seen. During the search, Alistair Douglas, the bassist for Blue Orchid, also otherwise known as Yellow, approached Brad and told him that he was sorry to hear Amy had gone missing. Brad acknowledged this and continued searching. The Bradley family then took it upon themselves to disembark from the ship and search the island of Curacao for their missing daughter and sister. This would prove extremely difficult though, as they were unable to communicate with the locals, had very little knowledge of the island, and were informed by the captain that they only had a short window of time to search for her, as they would be leaving Curacao, with or without the Bradleys on board. They did all they could in the little time that they had, but by that evening, the ship was about to leave, and they still hadn't found Amy. Left with the difficult decision whether to stay on board or not, they decided to stay on Curacao and continue their search. The Rhapsody of the Seas continued its journey, now 4 Bradleys short. It wasn't long until theories began as to what may have happened to Amy. The first theory came from the ship's senior crew and legal team, stating that Amy had likely fallen overboard in the early hours of the morning, sometime after Amy's father saw her sleeping on the balcony. This made little sense to the Bradleys, as they knew Amy hated the ocean and large waters, and insisted on holding on to someone whenever she was near the rails. Furthermore, the railing on the balcony where the Bradleys were staying was said to be about chest high on Amy, meaning if she did fall overboard, she would have needed to climb onto the rails in order to achieve going over. Her parents outright rejected this theory, again stating how unreasonable it would be for Amy to do this. It was even put to the Bradleys that Amy might have wanted to take her own life, which they vehemently denied was possible, as Amy was a happy young woman with a lot going for her. A new job, new home, new dog. Her life was coming together perfectly. Her postcards even showed that she was planning ahead beyond the holiday. The family just didn't see this as a possibility. Regardless, the idea that Amy may have gone overboard was not an out-of-this-world idea, whether intentional or not. So 24 hours after Amy went missing, a search and rescue operation was carried out on the waters of Curaçao, which included assistance from the Dutch Antilles Coast Guard in the form of 3 rescue helicopters. They had also requested a radar plane, a British Navy Royal ship, and help from other smaller cargo and fishing boats. But by the 29th of March 1998, 5 days into Amy's disappearance, the search was called off. Nobody was able to find Amy's body in or floating on the waters. Ron, Ivor, and Brad continued to insist that Amy didn't go overboard, especially denying any possibility that she would have done something like this willingly. They firmly believed that she was still somewhere on the ship, or even worse, had been taken from the vessel against her will. Ron insisted that the balcony door was closed at the time he saw Amy and opened by the time he woke to find her missing, meaning between 5:30 and 6 a.m, she must have left the room. Proving this would be an issue. As I mentioned earlier, the electronic tagging systems in place for guests only register times for when people entered their rooms, but not when they left them. However, the theory that Amy slipped out was given extra credence when a witness by the name of Crystal Roberts came forward and said that she had seen Amy with a band member walk over and up to the next deck above them. Around 10 minutes later, Crystal said they saw the same band member walking back around, this time by himself. The band member Crystal was referring to was none other than Blue Orchid's bassist, Alistair Yellow Douglas. Worried that the crew wouldn't take this possible sighting seriously, they visited the American Embassy on Curaçao, and from there were informed to contact the FBI for their help. Once the Bradleys explained their situation, the FBI agreed to help. However, it would take them 24 hours to get to them. They told Ron and Ivor to travel to St. Martin, the Rhapsody of the Sea's next destination. The boss of the insurance company Ron worked for flew into Curaçao and arranged a private flight for himself and the Bradleys to travel to St. Martin, as well as offer his assistance. Once they had arrived, the Bradleys arranged to meet the ship's captain. By now, the Royal Caribbean International captain had company in the form of the cruise liner's legal team. They told the family that the FBI had no jurisdiction on the ship, as it was registered to Norway, meaning the ship was under Curaçao and Norwegian laws. The agents had to obtain permission from the company itself before they were allowed to conduct an investigation on the ship. After much negotiation, 2 agents were allowed to board, although they had to be plain clothed so as not to disturb or distress the guests on board. By now, rumours were running rife on the Rhapsody of the Seas, with many talking about someone going overboard, possibly wanting to end their own life. Regardless, the FBI got to work investigating. First, they checked Amy's cabin and discovered her ID was still there, indicating that she was planning to return to the cabin. They also discovered that the initial search that the ship's staff was said to have carried out was nowhere near as thorough as they first thought. It transpired Gerstad had instructed the crew only to search the common areas and crew quarters, as he didn't want to disrupt the other guests. After learning this, Ron and Ivor were furious, and understandably so. If it was the case that Amy was somewhere else other than these areas at the time she disappeared, then it stood to reason that the crew failed to locate her at such a crucial stage of her going missing. The FBI agents then decided to carry out a full and thorough search of the ship but found no trace of Amy. Ron, Ivor and Bradley had no choice but to travel back to Curacao to continue their search. On the 28th of March 1998, one day before the search of the waters had concluded, the Bradley family would travel back to America without Amy. At the time, the Bradleys were convinced that Amy hadn't gone overboard, as they knew how frightened she was of the oceans and how her life was back at home. They believed that someone on board the ship, possibly a crew member, was involved, but the Royal Caribbean International's apparent desperation to minimise any reputational damage saw their efforts hampered. Meanwhile, Royal Caribbean International's stance was that this was an unfortunate case of someone going overboard, whether it was a drunken accident or a case of suicide. A spokesperson claimed that while the FBI was investigating the Bradleys' cabin, the furniture had been rearranged against the railing with footprints found on the rails. However, the FBI failed to corroborate or refute these claims, stating they wouldn't disclose this to Royal Caribbean International staff, but they wouldn't deny it either. So what exactly happened? While we can't say exactly for sure, what I will go through next demonstrates that what I've said before is only the tip of the iceberg. Before looking into possible sightings of Amy, it's important to talk about the role Alistair Douglas played in this case. Based on the eyewitness account of Crystal Roberts, Yellow was the last person to be seen alive with Amy, making him the FBI's main person of interest. On the night of Amy's disappearance, Yellow was dancing with Amy. Brad would say that, quote, "She said that when they were dancing at the disco, he tried to, dance a little too close, and she had to tell him to back off a little bit." Additionally, Brad had also realised that at the time Alistair approached him to offer his sympathies, he shouldn't have been aware of this, as only he, his parents, the ship's security chief, and captain were the only ones who knew Amy was missing. Alistair was brought in for questioning, where he explained that he and Amy were dancing in the Viking nightclub that night, but she had no other interest in him, and the pair eventually parted ways. He denied being with Amy at the time Crystal said she saw the pair. He would take a polygraph test, which would come back inconclusive, but as there was no evidence tying him directly to Amy's disappearance, he would be released without charge. Ron and Ivor listened to the interrogation from behind a two-way mirror. As Alistair left, he saw Ron and Ivor and turned to them, smiled, and put up two thumbs. It was said at the time of him doing this, Ron wanted to punch him there and then. Besides Alistair, there were also other things that didn't sit well with the Bradleys. The first being the waiters on the ship, in particular, the one who asked for Amy by name. After she disappeared, Ivor began to look at this interaction with him in a new light. She remembered Amy saying the staff gave her the creeps and that she wouldn't do anything with them. Not only this, but they started to believe that perhaps this crew member was trying to coerce Amy off of the ship for nefarious purposes. Ivor would say, quote, "Amy would have been a trophy. Amy would have been someone that, I believe, could have been picked out and fingered to move off of that ship. She could have been held and hidden. She could have been possibly drugged and taken from that ship." This theory gained further traction after it was discovered that on the night of Amy's disappearance, a photographer was hired by Royal Caribbean to take pictures of the passengers on board. He would then put these pictures on a board for the passengers to come and view. However, when the Bradleys went to look at their pictures, they found that all but Amy's pictures were there. They asked the photographer where Amy's pictures were, to which he confirmed that he had definitely printed them, meaning that someone had taken the pictures of Amy from the board. It's theorised that they were taken to show prospective buyers. Once the family returned home, they set up a 24-hour hotline for people to call in with leads. It wouldn't take long until the phone began ringing. A couple of days after the phone line was set up, the Bradleys received a phone call from a taxi driver from Curacao, who informed them that he had been approached by a woman who may have been Amy on the day that she vanished. He said that she asked if he had a phone that she could borrow, but she quickly ran away. The taxi driver recalled remembering her green eyes. Another man, a Puerto Rican police cadet, would tell of a time where he saw a woman being forcibly placed into a taxi by a strange man in a hat. In fact, while the family were in Curacao searching for Amy, 4 days into the search, Brad claimed to have heard Amy from inside a van. He gave chase and eventually caught up with the van, but there was no sign of Amy, just a lone driver. Brad to this day was unsure if he had chased down the wrong van, or whether his mind was playing games with him. There wouldn't be any further developments until 5 months after Amy had vanished, where the family were contacted by a Canadian man, David Carmichael. David was at home watching TV, where he saw a show providing coverage on the Amy Lynn Bradley case. This triggered a memory in David's mind. A few months earlier, he had been in Curacao with friends, when one day where he was on the beach, he noticed a woman walking alongside 2 men, a black man and a white man. According to David, the woman seemed to notice David speaking in English and turned sharply towards him. She began to make her way over to him, where she was stopped and taken away by the men. According to David, the black man then turned to him and gave him a menacing look as if to say, "Don't speak to this woman." This woman, David said, was Amy Lynn Bradley. She had tattoos which matched those Amy had, a Tasmanian devil on her shoulder, the sun on her back, a Chinese symbol on her right ankle, and a lizard found on her navel. The FBI would follow up on this lead, but by this time, it was too little, too late. The lead went cold. The next reported sighting wouldn't take place until the following year, when in 1999, an ex-American Navy officer claimed to have spoken to Amy while he was drinking in a brothel. While there, he claimed that a woman approached him and asked for his help, telling the man she was an American woman who was stuck and needed to get home. The officer explained to her to go to an American embassy, as well as informing her where his ship was docked, but she explained that this was impossible due to her papers being seized by her kidnappers. A quick note, Amy's papers were actually still on board the Rhapsody of the Seas at the time, so it's unclear why she would think this. Regardless, the officer failed to do anything and left the brothel. Add to that, he didn't come forward until 3 years later, in 2002, as at the time he was concerned about losing his Navy role if his superiors learned he had visited a brothel, and said nothing until he was discharged. He provided information on where to find the brothel, but unfortunately for authorities who were investigating, the premises had long since burned down, leaving no clues for anyone to work with. But perhaps the biggest and most promising sighting occurred when the Bradleys were contacted by a man named Frank Jones, who not only said he knew where Amy was, but that he could rescue her and bring her home. Frank Jones was a former US Army Special Forces officer turned gun for hire, who had been looking into the Amy Lynn Bradley case, where he caught wind of a lead. A woman by the name of Judith Margaretha said that she knew where Amy was. She described Amy in detail, right down to her tattoos, and even hummed a lullaby that Amy would have heard as a child, sang to her by Ivor. This was enough to convince Ron and Ivor that this lead was genuine. Margaretha told Ron and Ivor that she had seen Amy regularly grocery shopping, as well as at her local gym. She would say that Amy would often be with a man with long, blonde hair and a sleeve tattoo on one arm. She also told Ron and Ivor that Amy was being kept in a housing complex surrounded by barbed wire, which was heavily protected by armed Colombian guards. The family agreed for Jones to scout the area Judith described, and he recruited a team of ex-Army Rangers and ex-Navy SEALs to travel to Curacao to check out this lead and report their findings. They set up surveillance points around the complex and began watching and reporting back. It was reported that Amy had been seen alongside this blonde-haired man in a dark green SUV. In the report, it stated that Amy was in a dangerous situation, and the surveillance team even had to flee the island after a week, as they had been spotted and shot at by around 10 men. Despite this setback, Jones committed more men to the island and carried on reporting back to the family over the next few months. This operation would come at a cost. In total, the family had paid almost $25,000 to Jones, as well as receiving donations of over $186,000 from the nation's Missing Children organization, a charity which was set up to help families like Ron and Ivor's find their children. They had set up a specific fund for Amy's case, and it was these funds that were used to help pay Jones's costs. Eventually, Jones reported that the situation was becoming extremely dangerous for Amy, and it was feared that she may be executed. Therefore, the time had come to rescue her. But before he could do that, he needed more money to finance the rescue mission. But before Ron and Ivor agreed, they demanded to see proof that Amy was still alive. Happy to oblige, Jones sent them a picture of two people, a man and a woman at the beach, facing away from the camera. The picture showed a woman whose tattoos matched that of Amy's, and a man who had long blonde hair. Ron and Ivor were convinced that it was Amy, with Ivor saying, quote, "When I got the pictures, I knew Amy was okay, and it was just a matter of time." The family travelled to Florida and waited in a hotel, with Ron's boss hiring a private jet ready to take them to Curacao upon confirmation that the mission was complete. However, as the days came and went, no calls came. On the island of Curacao, one of the men tasked with watching the complex, Tim Buckholtz, overheard one of Jones's conversations with the Bradleys, updating them on Amy's movements and the Colombian gang who were keeping her against her will. However, Tim was one of the men watching the home, and what Jones was saying didn't add up. During this time surveillancing the home, he never spotted anything out of the norm. The people he was watching were just ordinary people. No barbed wire fencing, no armed Colombian guards, no blonde-haired man, and no Amy. It was at this point Tim realised that Frank Jones had been lying to the Bradleys for months. He would immediately contact the Bradleys and tell them the truth about the situation. The truth was that Frank Jones was never a serving officer in the Special Forces. In fact, he had never seen Amy on the island. He had somehow managed to convince genuine ex-officers to partake in a surveillance operation, when in fact the whole thing was an elaborate con, set up by him and a couple of his acquaintances. This meant the picture of Amy, that convinced even Ron and Ivor, was also a fake. One of Jones's team members, Jono Senk, would later admit to being the man in the image, where he donned a blonde wig, and the woman was another acquaintance who sported temporary tattoos to trick the Bradleys into believing she was their daughter. The beach wasn't even at Curacao, but in Pensacola, according to Senk. Frank Jones would later be arrested and charged with mail fraud. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and was ordered to pay back the money he conned from the Bradleys and the nation's missing children organisation. Judith Margaretha was also later found out to be a fraud. Her own son Giovanni would say, quote, "It's a lie. It's just using Amy's mother as a way of stealing." Judith denied lying, but also said that, quote, "Maybe I'm a bad person, but with all my badness, I want Mrs. Bradley really to find her girl." She ended up pocketing $8,000 as a result of the information she gave to the Bradleys. The pair were utterly devastated, but so desperate were they to find their daughter, they were prepared to put their trust in almost anyone. Ron Bradley would later say of this experience that, quote, "If there's a chance, what else do you do? If it was your child, what would you do? So I guess we took a chance, and I guess we lost." "2005 saw a couple of notable events, the first taking place in Barbados, where an American tourist named Judy Mora claimed to have seen Amy in a department store toilet. There, she witnessed a woman enter, along with 3 men. The men proceeded to threaten Amy over a potential deal they had made, telling her that she had no choice but to follow through with this deal. After the men left, Judy approached the woman to check on her. Judy said that the upset woman turned to her and said that her name was Amy and that she was from Virginia. But before she could say any more, the men re-entered and took her away. Judy reported this to the authorities, but again this led nowhere. She was, however, able to assist in helping authorities create composite sketches of the people there that day. Then, again in 2005, the Bradleys received an anonymous email providing pictures of a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Amy. The sender claimed that the images were from a Caribbean website which advertised sex workers. The woman in the pictures was named Jazz, and these showed her in various stages of undress. The family sent these to the FBI for further examination. After being looked at by several experts, they concluded that the images were of Amy, with one expert saying that he would bet his whole career on it being her. Unfortunately, like all other leads, this was as far as it went, as the FBI were unable to trace the origin of the photos, and again the case went cold. To this day, there have been no other sightings of Amy Lynn Bradley, although in 2010, her name would be brought up again after a jawbone containing a single wisdom tooth was discovered washed up on a beach in Aruba. The jawbone was tested, and it was determined to have belonged to a human Caucasian female. However, further tests revealed that it didn't belong to Amy, nor did it belong to Natalie Holloway, who was also another high-profile missing persons case at the time. And so that's where we are with this case. Ron and Ivor continue to search for their daughter and have made several TV appearances in the years since her disappearance in order to keep the case alive. The FBI are also still investigating this, and in 2018, they released aged progressed photos showing what Amy may look like today. They ask anyone with any potential information to come forward and contact them. There is still a $250,000 reward that the family are offering for information leading to Amy's return, as well as a $50,000 reward for information leading to a verifiable location. The FBI have also posted a $25,000 reward for information leading to her recovery.
Saturday morning, jumped out of bed, put on my best suit, got in my car and raced like a jet, all the way to you. Why you gotta be so rude? Don't you know I'm human too? Why you gotta be so rude? I'm gonna marry you anyway, marry like...
The voice that you're listening to belongs to 22-year-old Taylor McAllister. On the 22nd of December 2016, Taylor's lifeless body was discovered in an alley in South St. Petersburg with nothing but a grey t-shirt on. It was no secret to her family that she was battling addiction, but when her death was immediately treated as a homicide, her parents' worst fears had been realised. While it appears from the outside looking in that there was a clear suspect who was responsible for her murder, police have since considered Taylor's death to be a cold case. Her parents continue to fight for justice and for the truth to be revealed, as many believe that a cover-up has taken place. Taylor McAllister was born in Melbourne, Florida, on the 21st of July 1994, to parents Bill and Leslie McAllister. She was one of 5 children and the second oldest of her siblings. Taylor loved the beach and going out on boats to look at dolphins. She also loved spending time with her family and came from a very close-knit household. She was a happy child who was very outgoing, and she especially loved to sing and dance. She also attended Tarpon Springs High School, where she would successfully graduate. When Taylor was 14 years old, she had been gifted a guitar, and amazingly, she had taught herself to play. At first, she would perform to her friends and family, but would eventually begin uploading videos to YouTube of herself, covering popular songs at the time while playing her instrument. Her YouTube channel is still active to this day, and it was apparent that Taylor was a very talented young woman. Furthermore, she also had an affinity for hair and makeup, often doing her sister's hair and makeup for them. She was described as being very close to her siblings, spending as much time with them as possible growing up. Taylor was described as having a magnetic personality. She was someone who was easily likable, and she was able to get on well with anyone she met. When Taylor was 18, she moved out of the family home, but unfortunately for her, she began interacting with people that would begin to have a negative influence on her. Before she moved out, Taylor's parents commented that she never attended parties and was known at her school as being straight edge, instead opting to stay at home with her family. But after mixing in with her new acquaintances, she was out partying and drinking, and she would eventually start taking pills, which would result in her developing an addiction, something which she would admit to her parents later on. In a bid to get Taylor back on the straight and narrow, she would return to her parents' home in order to get better. Taylor would find work at a nearby Japanese restaurant, where she would meet a man named Joshua Welvert. Joshua was part of the Coast Guard, and the pair would quickly hit things off, eventually agreeing to marry after just a few months of dating each other. Joshua, however, had his own demons he was battling, as he also had a drug problem. This would only exacerbate Taylor's addiction, resulting in her taking harder drugs. In 2013, Taylor and Joshua announced that they would be expecting twins. Taylor was understandably very excited at the prospect of becoming a mother and prioritised getting herself clean. Joshua, who was scheduled for deployment as part of his Coast Guard duties, would be leaving Taylor alone. Bill and Leslie offered Taylor the opportunity to move in with them to help her throughout her pregnancy, to which she accepted. Taylor moved back to Florida, and she would remain off drugs, testing negative when regularly tested throughout her entire pregnancy. But when Taylor gave birth to her 2 babies in March 2014, she would be prescribed Percocet to treat pain after going through a cesarean birth. Leslie noticed that Taylor went through her bottle alarmingly quickly. After Taylor reached out to her doctor and asked for a new bottle, Leslie would monitor Taylor's usage and noticed that she would come to her far more often than she needed to. Over time, Taylor fought a battle on two fronts. She was determined to be a good mother to her two girls, and she absolutely adored them both. Taylor had always been family orientated, and now she had her own children to care for. She strived to be a good role model. However, the addiction she fought so hard since her pregnancy had taken a hold of her again. During the following months, Taylor would go through various highs and lows, going in and out of rehab several times. Taylor would eventually try and put her mind to something positive, looking at building a career for herself. She spoke with her parents about studying cosmetology, but before things could get moving, Taylor had again found herself surrounded by negative influences. She fell back into taking hard drugs and involving herself with people who could support her drug habit. Taylor's parents tried to continue helping her, taking her to rehab and attempting to remove her from the people she was involved in, but everything they tried seemed to fail. August 2016 was a pivotal time in Taylor's life. Both she and Joshua moved out of Bill and Leslie's home, and the pair would live in their car. The children, however, would stay with Bill and Leslie. By now, Taylor's drug addiction had fully taken hold of her, and she would spend the next few weeks either at various hotels or sleeping in their car. Not long after, Taylor and Joshua would go their separate ways. In September, a friend of Taylor's would tell her about a website called Backpage. Taylor, who was looking to earn money, was told by the friend that the website caters to individuals who ask women to model swimsuits and have their pictures taken, whereby they would be able to keep the swimsuits and be paid for providing the photos. However, there was a much darker purpose of the website that Taylor's apparent friend was keeping from her. In truth, the website was known as being a sex marketplace. The website no longer exists after the FBI seized it in 2018 for child exploitation and obscenity. Taylor was essentially groomed into participating in Backpage, believing it to be nothing more than a harmless modelling website in which she could earn easy money, although she quickly found this to not be the case. While using Backpage, she came across a man named Robert Butler III, who liked to be called Bert by his friends. Robert was the son of Robert Butler Jr., a wealthy man who owned a local chain of stores called Bob's Carpet and Flooring. While Robert Butler Jr. worked incredibly hard to build up his business, to the point where 16 stores are open across Florida to this day, his son doesn't quite share the same work ethic. Robert, for all intents and purposes, could be considered a trust fund kid. The wealth he possessed came from his family, and at the age of 52, he hadn't really made a name for himself. He was an heir to his father's business and had opportunities to make a positive contribution. But instead, his most notable contributions included a conviction on aggravated assault with a firearm, false imprisonment, battery, plus numerous drugs possession charges. He was also at loggerheads with his two sisters over control over the family business, with one sister saying in a 2015 civil lawsuit that Robert was hurting the business, selling company products for personal profit, using company funds to purchase excessive amounts of alcohol, and that he was a bad company representative, citing a time where he was banned from a trade organization convention in Hawaii for egregious behavior. Robert also knew a man named Deontay Baker, who lived at Butler's $500,000 home in Palm Harbor, and was essentially a living drug dealer. Once Butler was introduced to Taylor, he instantly became obsessed with her. She no longer needed to continue using Backpage, as Butler would supply her with drugs, money, and gifts all on demand. Effectively, he was her sugar daddy. By November 2016, Taylor was now living with Robert Butler, and now under his full control. He would quickly isolate her from her friends and family. In fact, Leslie's last communication with Taylor was in September, by text, where Taylor wished her mother happy birthday. According to friends of Taylor, they could only speak with her if Butler wasn't present, as she would become audibly agitated whenever he was around. Additionally, Butler was said to possess an explosive temper. They also claimed that attempts to visit Taylor would result in them being kicked out of the property by Butler. Finally, Taylor's friends said that there were times where she would openly admit to being scared and that she wanted to leave, but they were ultimately unable to convince her to follow through with this. On the 1st of December 2016, Butler's father passed away at the age of 83, and shortly after, Deontay Baker moved out of Butler's home, leaving just Robert Butler III and Taylor McAllister in the home. All attempts to contact her were unsuccessful, and she wouldn't be seen again until later that month, on the 22nd of December. At about 6:57 on the morning of the 22nd of December 2016, police received a call from a retired sanitation worker who was out picking up cans near the 2100 block of 63rd Avenue South, St. Petersburg, Florida, when he stumbled across the body of a young woman who had been left dumped in an alley within a patch of grass. The woman had been left with just a grey t-shirt on, which was pulled right up, and she was completely naked from the waist down. There was heavy bruising across much of her body, as well as multiple cuts, and there were tyre marks imprinted on her, indicating that she had been run over. She was also laid out, legs spread. The woman, of course, was Taylor McAllister. She was just 22 years old at the time. After Taylor was positively identified by police, the next task was to inform her parents. They'd each be informed separately, as Leslie was working her job as a paramedic, while Bill was at home looking after their children. Leslie would be taken into her manager's office at around 11:30 a.m, where she saw co-workers and two individuals she had never met. The pair would tell Leslie the devastating news about her daughter. Leslie would later tell the Unmasked YouTube channel in an interview posted on the 21st of January 2021 that the moment she was told Taylor was deceased and that it was being treated as a homicide, she felt every possible emotion in a split second. Bill would say in the same interview that while he was on the front lawn, he noticed a black sedan slowly creeping down the road, clearly searching for an address. When he realised that the address they were looking for was his, he described it as being like a movie where everything was happening in slow motion. Two detectives got out the car and approached him. Immediately he knew something bad had happened. The detectives ushered him into the home and broke the news to him. Their youngest child was in the same room at the time Bill was told Taylor had been found dead. The initial investigation into Taylor's murder was slow, as police were working to build up a list of suspects. Not only this, but there were murmurs reportedly going on that police were skeptical that Taylor had been killed, with some allegedly believing that she had simply died from an overdose. This was further supported by witnesses claiming that some officers would refer to Taylor as a junkie or a whore. Additionally, the case was made all the more difficult in that there were no witnesses who saw Taylor's body being dumped where she was found, and attempts to establish her last known movements proved difficult, as conversations with Taylor's friends proved fruitless, given that contact with them and her family had effectively stopped. However, they were able to find out that the last known place she was staying at was Robert Butler's, and so they went to pay him a visit. When they went to his Palm Harbor home, they noticed he had fresh scratches on his face, nose and arm. Additionally, a recent bruise was also noted on his shoulder. He put these minor injuries down to a dog that he rescued from Hurricane Katrina. He also named Deontay Baker and another man, Karan Archer, as being at his home the day before Taylor was found, and that Deontay had borrowed his truck. But when the conversation moved to discussing Taylor McAllister, Butler clamped up and sought legal counsel. Interestingly, a search warrant wasn't requested for Butler's home, and the body cam footage of his interview that day was never released. In hindsight, the former was a crucial misstep, as it later emerged that Taylor's clothes and belongings were burned, Butler's mattress was disposed of, surveillance footage was also destroyed, and his truck had been thoroughly cleaned out. The only items that belonged to Taylor, which were not removed or destroyed, was her Bible and her guitar. Taylor McAllister would be laid to rest at Dobie's funeral home on the 28th of December 2016. The family opted to have an open casket funeral for their daughter, but were horrified when they saw the condition that Taylor was in. Up until this point, they hadn't seen Taylor, and were assured by police that her appearance was not as severe as what they were witnessing. Heartbreakingly, Bill and Leslie's 5-year-old daughter asked them how they were able to get a life-size statue of Taylor into the casket. When Taylor McAllister's autopsy results came back in February 2017, the medical examiner learned that in addition to the obvious injuries and bruising on her, there were several cuts inside her mouth. Extensive trauma was found on her head and neck, as well as the aforementioned tire tracks on her legs. She sustained severe petechial hemorrhaging over much of her neck and chest, as well as her eyes, with the examiner describing her eyes as looking like they had been filled in with red marker pen. It was, as the examiner put it, the worst case he had ever seen. Tape residue was also found on her wrists and face, and although Taylor's drug abuse had taken a toll on her body, such as bacteria being found in her heart and also kidney damage, any suggestion that she had died from a drug overdose was completely ruled out. Instead, her death was ruled a homicide by asphyxia. The examiner couldn't determine whether this was caused by smothering or by strangulation, but the possibility that it was positional asphyxiation, that is to say that Taylor put herself into a position where she herself had cut off the oxygen to her brain, had been ruled out entirely. DNA not belonging to Taylor was also found underneath her fingernails, as well as touch DNA being found on her neck. According to Bill and Leslie, prior to the autopsy results being revealed, investigators assured them that the medical examiner carrying out Taylor's autopsy was very reliable and that their findings would dictate the next course of action. But they would also try and prepare Bill and Leslie for the news that Taylor's death may have been an overdose. However, when the news came back confirming that Taylor had indeed been murdered, those who were investigating Taylor's case had apparently developed a different opinion of the examiner. What they would do instead is look deeper into Robert's financial records, where they would find an unusually high number of burner phones purchased by him. This led them to dig even deeper, where they would uncover Butler issuing exceptionally large checks to Deontay Baker, Karan Archer, and several of his friends. As a result, the FBI were brought in and a separate investigation began, where they focused on the money laundering and drug ties. At one stage, Deontay Baker offered to speak with Robert Butler by telephone, where they could monitor their conversation. The aim of this was to get Butler to open up about what happened to Taylor. However, when the pair spoke, Butler refused to discuss this on the phone, instead offering Deontay the opportunity to visit his home to speak about it. While Deontay was allegedly prepared to do this, police prevented him from going there. Throughout the course of 2017, police would gather evidence in the form of statements from her friends, and they would attempt to build a timeline of events leading up to the 21st of December 2016. Robert Butler's DNA was also taken as part of the investigation, and to absolutely no one's surprise, it matched both the touch DNA and the DNA found underneath Taylor's fingernails. Bill McAllister, upon learning this after reading the reports, contacted the police and asked for an update. He was initially told that the DNA didn't match Butler's, but after Bill provided them with a screenshot showing where it said the DNA matched his, they shrugged this off by stating that they deal with many cases and couldn't expect to remember each one clearly. Even though they had this evidence, investigators would still not issue an arrest, arguing that it wasn't enough to arrest Butler for Taylor's murder. They suggested the DNA could have gotten there a number of ways, given that Taylor was already living in Butler's property at the time. By now, Taylor's parents were understandably very frustrated with the investigation. There seemed to be no positive movement, and although it appeared that there were grounds to make arrests, none had been made. But on the 12th of December 2017, almost a year after Taylor was killed, a search warrant was finally issued on Butler's property, and he, along with Deontay Baker and Karan Archer, would be questioned again by police. What I'm about to tell you are the events that Deontay Baker, Karan Archer, and Robert Butler say happened in their separate interviews with police. According to Butler, in the days leading up to the 21st of December 2016, Taylor had been severely unwell, leading to him contacting Deontay Baker, who was with Karan Archer, another man named Desmond Washington, and two other unnamed associates. He said the reason for the call was to get Taylor help. After arriving to Butler's 45 minutes following on from the phone call, they would find Taylor sprawled out on Butler's bed with just her grey shirt on. Butler told them that she had wet herself, and so he removed her clothes. It was alleged that Taylor was clearly in pain, and it was said that she was moaning in agony. Robert essentially ordered Baker and Archer to remove Taylor from his home and to take her to a nearby hospital. Robert refused to help move Taylor, as it was alleged that he didn't want to touch her. Additionally, suggestions of calling 911 were also rebuked by Butler, over fears police would find his large quantity of drugs in the home, as well as firearms he wasn't permitted to own. Taylor would apparently be wrapped in a bedsheet and carried to Robert's truck, a white Toyota Tundra, by Desmond Washington. Karan Archer would be the one driving the truck, but he had difficulty in finding a hospital for Taylor, claiming to be unfamiliar with the area. However, it was revealed that the route they described taking saw them pass at least 8 hospitals, meaning if Taylor was alive at the time, as they all claimed, this was crucial time that was wasted. Eventually, it was said that Taylor tragically passed away in the back of Robert's Toyota Tundra. When Archer and Baker realised what had happened, they would call Butler for advice, but he told them not to bring her back, instead telling them both to just, quote, take care of it, and suggested dumping her where nobody would find her. They would drive for another 25 miles, considering potential burial plots as they drove, but they would eventually settle on dumping her in the alley out in the open, without the sheet they initially carried her into the car with. To add insult to injury, after they dumped Taylor, they ran her over while speeding away, but they insisted that this was an accident. They then returned to Robert Butler's home and got to work removing any evidence of Taylor's existence from the property. As I mentioned earlier, her clothes and belongings were burned, CCTV footage was destroyed, the mattress was disposed of, and the truck was thoroughly cleaned. All men insisted that her death was a drugs overdose, despite the autopsy report stating otherwise. Robert Butler, Deontay Baker, and Karan Archer were all charged with, and later convicted of, failing to report a death. Butler would be sentenced to a year in prison, but served just 8 months. He would also be convicted on money laundering charges and sentenced to an additional 40 months prison time in 2018, but this was later reduced to 27 months. His sentence was up on the 11th of September 2021, meaning he is now a free man. Deontay Baker was also sentenced to a year in prison, but this was to be served concurrently with another conviction for federal drugs charges, impacting his overall sentence in no way whatsoever. Karan Archer would only be sentenced to 6 months jail time, but would only serve 4. However, no charges were ever brought up for the destruction of and disposal of Taylor's belongings, despite them openly admitting to doing so. This was surprising, given that crucial evidence would have most likely been destroyed in the process. Furthermore, to this day, no murder charges have been made, and police consider Taylor's murder to be a cold case. To this day, Taylor's family continue to fight to have her story heard. They've been openly candid about Taylor's story, acknowledging the difficulties she's experienced in life, and even made the brave decision to share her crime scene photos with the public. Naturally, I won't be sharing them here, but you can find them if you look. It goes without saying that they have also been openly critical of the investigation into Taylor's murder, and perhaps rightly so. For starters, they're certainly right in questioning why no charges have been brought up against Butler, considering that police reported witnessing scratches and marks on his face and body on the first occasion they spoke with him after finding Taylor. This seems to link up nicely with the DNA found under Taylor's fingernails, as well as the touch DNA found on her body. And yet, no murder charges. Nothing. As I mentioned earlier, police argued this could have gotten there in a number of ways, given that Taylor was living with Butler. But considering that there have been arrests and convictions handed down with much less evidence in the past, I find it bewildering as to why this wasn't explored further. There's also the interviews which took place with all three men on the 12th of December 2017. While many criticised the manner in which the interviews were conducted, with one accusation being that interrogators were far too friendly with Butler, Baker and Archer, those who watch channels like JCS will be familiar with the Reed technique. Now, it could be argued that police were merely following this technique in order to build up rapport with the suspects. However, after listening to the interviews that were available, links to which I've provided in the description below, either this was followed extremely poorly, or not at all. Usually with the Reed technique, one of the first steps is to positively confront the suspect and provide an opportunity to explain why the offence took place. But I personally found that police were more interested in discussing the overdose narrative with the three men, despite this being refuted in Taylor's autopsy report. Furthermore, the men were constantly reassured that everything was okay, which I can get if you're attempting to build trust in order to get that all-important confession. But given that there was no real challenge to their version of events, I struggle to understand what the purpose of this was. While I don't personally believe that Deontay and Karan were directly involved in Taylor's murder, they were definitely involved in the cleanup, suggesting that maybe they knew more than they were letting on. Leslie McAllister even took the brave step in speaking with Deontay Baker directly, in the hopes he would open up to her. Again, I've left a link in the description to this conversation, but it's harrowing stuff. Many people hold the belief that Robert Butler is the man police should be looking at for Taylor's murder, and if anything, his version of events should definitely warrant more scrutiny. Given what I've learned about this case, I can't see any reason why not to. But instead, the police are more concerned with hitting Bill and Leslie McAllister with cease and desist orders, claiming that the family is spreading false information about Taylor's case, information which is publicly available according to Bill and Leslie. Additionally, Taylor's homicide case was apparently reviewed by SPPD Major Matthew Furse, who determined that the investigation was conducted properly. Although it may be argued that the police simply investigated itself and found it did nothing wrong. Now, I've explored unsolved cases in the past which may or may not have had criminal undertones, such as the Amy Lynn Bradley case or the case of the Sodder children. But this case genuinely has me questioning what the hell went wrong here. From the outside looking in, it seems blatantly clear that there were serious failings with this investigation, and I wholly support Bill and Leslie in their goal to get Taylor's story heard. If you have a Facebook account, I've left a link in the description for you to follow them for updates relating to this case. I've also left a link to an interview the pair did on the Unmasked YouTube channel, where they discuss the case in more detail, as well as give a first-hand experience of the investigation. I sincerely hope for the whole McAllister family that the truth as to what happened to Taylor, a mother, a sister, a daughter, will be uncovered, and that they're able to finally get justice for her. Thank you for watching. If you found this case informative, please consider hitting the like button and sharing this with anyone you may know, as it really helps get my content out to a wider audience. Please also feel free to share your thoughts in the comments section below. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. You may also want to sign up to become a channel member. Speaking of which, here's a special thank you to my current members, The Alabastard, Needle and Fur, Mr. Gently Benevolent, and Amanda. Thank you for your continued support. I greatly appreciate it. Until next time, take care and goodbye. For now.
I've been trying to do it right. I've been living a lonely life. I've been sleeping here instead.